I'm going to start off by saying that if at any point during my speech you need to leave and take a step out, I understand and I give you permission to. Take a step back and go to high school with me. Think of the hardest, most frustrating test you took. Okay, you have that? I was sitting in my physics class taking that test. And I was getting through it. It was another test. We've all taken one. And I kept taking my test while the rest of the class looked up. Somebody had slammed their hand down against the table, and I knew exactly who it was. I kept going, because that was an issue for later, until I hear it again. And this time, I did look up. I looked up across the room at my boyfriend at the time, as he's sitting there covered in frustration and anger with this test, and the girl sitting across from him is covered in fear. I took that time and I told myself to focus on this test that I was taking. I needed to pass it, and I would deal with that later tonight when I went to his house. I would pay for that test that frustrated and angered him so much. This is something that I went through a year ago, and this is something that many people go through on a daily basis. And today I wanted to discuss with you the 3 most common psychological disorders that result due to dating violence: depression, anxiety, and PTSD. I obviously have gone through all 3 based on my experiences, but Dr. Deborah L. Radigan, a tenured professor at the University of Tennessee, has committed her research to finding the correlation between these psychological disorders and dating violence. So through dating violence, how you get to all of this is through the things that have been said to you: the psychological and emotional abuse, the physical abuse of throwing things, hitting, shoving, and the sexual abuse, which we can all imagine what that could be. So to define dating violence, according to the state of California, dating violence is abuse or threats of abuse while in an intimate relationship. The DSM-5 also has its own definition that is very long and extensive, so I'm not going to do that one, because the California one is more prevalent. The DSM-5 also is your how to diagnose everyone with a psychological disorder. And it defines depression as a serious medical illness that negatively affects the way you feel, how you act, and how you think. It manifests itself with symptoms of lack of motivation, irritability, apathy, fatigue, and suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation being that idea and that desire to want to hurt yourself and kill yourself. And in 2016, Dr. Radigan and her team at the University of Tennessee did research to find the correlation between suicidal ideation and dating violence. So they found that dating violence eventually leads to feelings of thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. Thwarted belongingness meaning that someone has cut off your feelings of belonging to a group, and perceived burdensomeness meaning that you feel like you're a problem for the people that you are around. And with both of those combined, they had a 0.75 correlation between suicidal ideation and both of those, which isn't high, but it's still high enough that it makes you worry, because that's 0.15 of the people who have been through both that want to kill themselves. One of the next most common things is anxiety. And the DSM-5 determines anxiety as a persistent and excessive worry that interferes with daily activities. Your symptoms are racing thoughts, excessive worry, trembling, insomnia, fear. It's this consistent, all the time, fight or flight response from your body where your mind is racing, you want to run, you want to hide, and you don't know why sometimes. Now, of course, this generally manifests itself because of physical abuse, because you don't know what you might do to make the other person angry. You don't know what you might do later to set off your boyfriend from that anger he already feels from taking that test that morning. But Dr. Radigan again did research on anxiety and dating violence, and she found that when shame is involved in this, when you make your significant other feel bad about what they've done, there is a higher correlation between anxiety and dating violence. And it was so high that there was a correlation of almost 1 in men, which some of you may be surprised, but anxiety is more common in men than depression is. Women still had a 0.7 correlation with anxiety and dating violence with that shame involvement, but a correlation of 1 is a perfect correlation. You could say that anxiety comes from dating violence, but of course that is not how statistics works, so we don't say that. Now, what Dr. Radigan has found is that PTSD is the most common psychological disorder that comes from dating violence. And the DSM-5 defines it as a psychiatric disorder that can occur in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event. In this case, that traumatic event is dating violence. Its symptoms are flashbacks, hyperarousal, mistrust, self-destructive behavior, and social isolation. And that big flashback symptom is what gets that PTSD's involvement with war veterans and rape victims. But this does affect everyone who's been through some sort of dating violence, because it is a spectrum disorder. You don't have to be an extreme to have it. You can be somewhat lower and actually still be diagnosed with PTSD. In 2011, the University of Tennessee did research on how women go about their new dating relationships and what they do if they're put into another abusive relationship. And they found that women who had already been in an abusive relationship, when put in another, stayed in that relationship longer than women who had not already been through that sort of violence. Because those women had lesser feelings of self-efficacy and more feelings of shame. So they determined that they deserved that. Now, one of those big PTSD symptoms, again, is mistrust. And I'm going to end with, if somebody comes to you and says that they've been through any of this, I beg you to listen to them, to believe them, and to support them in what they end up doing. Whether that is to stay in that relationship and try and fight it, or if that is to leave the relationship. Because it is scary to leave that relationship because you don't know what will happen. And if you've been through this and you don't know who to talk to, let me be a resource to you. I've been through it firsthand. I know the resources that are available, and I completely understand and acknowledge that not going to get help from the police, your parents, any campus resources is a perfectly valid option.